a peaceful shore, a quiet night, and one body too many. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ravella. I love hearing from this mystery-loving community. Where are you tuning in from today? Your words make every tale come alive. Let's begin. The little village of St. Mildred's by the sea was the sort of place that postcards envy. Whitewashed cottages with lavender-lined paths, seagulls circling lazily above, and a church spire that peeked out modestly from behind elm trees. To those who lived there, life was as predictable as the tides. Nothing ever truly changed, except perhaps the colour of Mrs. Dacre's front door or the weekly scandal. At the grocer's counter, it was on a pleasantly bright June afternoon that Mrs. Helena Faraday hosted her annual garden tea at Seaside Cottage, the prettiest house along the cliff. Her hydrangeas, famously blue, were the pride of the village, and her lemon drizzle cake was known to disarm even the sternest gossip. The event drew nearly every notable soul in St. Mildred's: Colonel and Mrs. Lacey from the rectory, the widowed Miss Hargreaves, who wore mourning still, though her husband had passed 20 years ago, and naturally Miss Jane Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead to spend a few restful weeks by the sea. The gathering began with laughter and the clinking of china cups. Helena Faraday fluttered about, a vision in lavender silk, her manner brisk yet charming. She took evident pleasure in pairing guests in conversation. Miss Marple with the rector's wife, the colonel with the local artist, and her niece, young Alice Brent, with Mr. Julian Torrance, a novelist of modest fame who had recently rented a cottage nearby. Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly, her pale blue eyes observing the scene with gentle interest. There was something about the way young Alice blushed each time Julian Torrance spoke, an innocence that betrayed admiration, perhaps even affection. Miss Marple noted it without judgment. She had seen such things before. Young girls were apt to fall in love with charming men who did not always deserve it. As the afternoon waned, a sharp cry pierced the pleasant chatter. Cups clattered. Mrs. Lacey nearly dropped her plate. Alice Brent stood at the edge of the garden path, her face white as parchment. It's Mr. Torrance," she gasped. "In the summer house. He's dead." The crowd surged toward the little ivy-covered summer house at the end of the lawn. Inside, Julian Torrance sat slumped in a wicker chair, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. A teacup lay shattered on the ground beside him, a faint trace of white froth clinging to its rim. His eyes were open but glassy, staring toward the sea. Mrs. Faraday gave a strangled sob. The colonel barked orders for someone to fetch the doctor. Miss Marple, moving more swiftly than one might expect for her years, stepped closer. Her hand hovered briefly over the broken cup before she looked up, her expression mild but thoughtful. "Such a pity," she murmured softly, almost to herself. "A charming man, I should think, and quite careless too. But then so many are. No one heard her." The first whispers were already spreading through the gathering like ripples through still water. "Poison," someone said. "An accident," said another. "A jealous lover," muttered a third. And as the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and lemon blossoms across the garden, Miss Marple gazed out toward the cliffs, where the gulls wheeled in silence. In her mind, the patterns had already begun to form, faint, elusive, but unmistakable. A man dead at a seaside tea, a cup overturned, and a village full of secrets, waiting to be unpicked. Would you like me to continue with part 2? The village reacts next, where gossip spreads through St. Mildred's, and the first suspicions begin to take shape. The following morning dawned misty and grey. as if the sea itself mourned the events of the previous day. A hush had settled over St. Mildred's by the Sea, though the hush was not of peace, but of tension, of whispers barely stifled behind lace curtains, and the rustle of newspapers carrying grim headlines. Mystery death at Seaview Cottage, they declared, as though the small village were now the stage of something grand and terrible. The villagers, in truth, relished the drama even as they feared it. At Mrs. Dacre's general store, conversation was as brisk as the morning air. "Poison, mark my words," declared Mrs. Lacey, peering over the marmalade jars. "Didn't you see the cup? Foam on the rim. My husband said so himself. Dr. Lacey never mistakes such things." Mrs. Dacre nodded with solemn conviction. Man doesn't die like that for nothing. And to think, right there in Helena Faraday's garden. I always said that woman kept odd company. Odd company. Miss Hargreaves sniffed, leaning forward. That Mr. Torrance was no saint, you may depend upon it. I've heard tales, London habits, and a temper when in drink. Oh yes, the genteel ones always have their vices. Behind them, quietly selecting a tin of biscuits, stood Miss Marple. Her expression betrayed nothing of judgment or curiosity. She thanked Mrs. Dacre with her usual politeness, tucked the tin under her arm, and stepped out into the damp morning air. But her thoughts were already deep at work, threading through fragments of conversation and memory like the fine lace she so often mended. The police had come, of course, a young Inspector Graves from the nearby town of Milchester. He was brisk, earnest, and rather proud of his position, though he looked ill at ease in the genteel surroundings of Seaview Cottage. He had arrived shortly after the doctor's pronouncement. Mr. Julian Torrance was dead from what appeared to be strychnine poisoning. Whether accidental or deliberate, no one yet knew. But Inspector Graves was confident that he soon would. By midday, the investigation was underway. Helena Faraday sat in her drawing-room, pale and trembling, her teacup untouched before her. Miss Marple, visiting under the guise of offering comfort, sat nearby, her knitting basket at her feet. The inspector questioned Helena gently, yet with persistence. "Mrs. Faraday, would you describe the events of yesterday afternoon? As precisely as you can, please." Helena dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "It was just my annual tea. Everyone was there, as they always are. Julian arrived around 3, I think. He seemed perfectly well, though perhaps a little tired. He'd been walking along the cliffs that morning. Did you see him drink the tea?" "Yes, I served it myself. He asked for lemon, no sugar. He took a scone, but hardly touched it. And afterward, he went to the summer house. He said he wanted a bit of quiet to jot something down in his notebook. Alice, my niece, went to fetch him when it was time for the group photograph. Then she screamed. Helena's voice faltered. Oh, poor child. She was quite hysterical. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the pause. Such a shock, naturally, she murmured. Young people are not accustomed to tragedy, though I dare say Miss Brent is a sensitive sort. She felt things deeply yesterday. Helena looked at her, a touch of gratitude softening her expression. She was very fond of him, I think. Foolish of her, perhaps, but he was so attentive. Attentive men can sometimes be dangerous, Miss Marple said gently, as though speaking to no one in particular, especially when their attentions are not entirely sincere. Inspector Graves gave her a quick, assessing glance. He had heard of Miss Marple, though he found it difficult to take advice from elderly ladies in floral hats. Still, something about her calmness intrigued him. Would you say, Mrs. Faraday, that Mr. Torrance had any enemies? Enemies? Helena repeated uncertainly. Oh, surely not. He was a bit, well, proud, perhaps. Some might call him vain. But he was charming when he wished to be. Miss Marple's eyes flicked briefly to the mantelpiece, where a framed photograph stood. Julian Torrance, with a faintly mocking smile, his arm around a striking woman in a fur coat. Not Alice, certainly. Someone older. London, perhaps. She filed the image away. Later that afternoon, as the village gathered its courage to resume its routines, Miss Marple took her customary walk along the promenade. The sea had turned silver under the clouded sky, gulls swooping low over the tide. She walked past the row of cottages until she reached the end, where Alice Brent sat alone on a bench overlooking the water. The girl's eyes were red, and she clutched a handkerchief in trembling fingers. "Such a sad business," Miss Marple said softly as she approached. "I hope you don't mind a little company, my dear." Alice shook her head. "I can't seem to make sense of it. He was perfectly fine, Miss Marple. Laughing one moment, and then—" Her voice broke. "They say it was poison, but that's impossible. Who would want to harm Julian?" "That is often the question," Miss Marple said kindly, sitting beside her. "One must ask not who wished to harm him, but who might have benefited from his being out of the way." Alice turned toward her, startled. "But no one had any reason, unless—" She stopped, her expression tightening. "Unless—" Alice hesitated. "It's probably nothing. Just, there was an argument. The day before, I overheard him speaking with Aunt Helena. They thought I'd gone to fetch the post. I couldn't hear everything, but I remember him saying something about money, and a promise not kept." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze on the sea. "Money is a very old motive, my dear, as old as jealousy, and often more dangerous." The girl shivered. "Do you think the police will suspect her, my aunt?" "The police," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "are very good at noticing facts, but human nature, alas, requires a rather different kind of observation." As the evening drew in, Miss Marple returned to Seaview Cottage, where Helena sat by the fire, the room dim except for the flickering light. A maid moved quietly about, her eyes lowered. There was an air of dread in the house, as though something unseen lingered there still. Miss Marple stood a moment by the mantelpiece, examining the photograph again. She leaned closer, noting the inscription scrawled across the corner. "To J. With all my love, Em." The handwriting was elegant, the sentiment unmistakable. "Helena," she said softly. "This lady, she was a friend of Mr. Torrance's." Helena followed her gaze and paled. "That was Millicent Harrow, a singer. He used to— Oh, it was nothing serious. He said she was a friend from his theatre days." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "It is so often the nothing serious acquaintances who turn out to be most inconvenient later on." That night, long after the lamps were extinguished, Miss Marple sat awake in her little guest room, her knitting untouched in her lap. The sea murmured beyond the window, the rhythm of the waves steady and solemn. She reviewed every detail in her mind, the teacup, the foam, the argument about money, the photograph, the young girl's tears. There were threads here, delicate and fine, but they were beginning to intertwine. She sensed pride, deceit, perhaps desperation. Someone had acted with purpose, though not with skill. The poison had been crude, too obvious. That, she knew, was the first clue, not to who had killed Julian Torrance, but to what they feared most being discovered. In the distance, the church clock chimed midnight. Miss Marple rose and drew the curtains closed. The seaside town slept uneasily, but her eyes remained bright and wakeful. Somewhere within St. Mildred's, she thought, there was someone whose heart was not sleeping at all, someone watching the same dark sea, and wondering whether Miss Marple had already begun to suspect the truth. The next day brought with it a clarity of light that seemed almost mocking in its brightness. Sunlight spilled over the thatched roofs and glinted off the sea like 1,000 tiny mirrors. But beneath that deceptive calm, St. Mildred's stirred with uneasy life. The villagers went about their routines with an exaggerated sense of purpose, each one careful to appear untroubled, though eyes darted and voices lowered whenever two people crossed paths. The death of Julian Torrance had not only upset their peace, it had disturbed something deeper, a sense that beneath their tidy gardens and lace curtains, danger had been sitting patiently, waiting to be noticed. Inspector Graves had taken up temporary residence at the vicarage, where he set about interviewing every guest from the garden tea. He was determined to present results to his superiors quickly. After all, it was an open and shut case, or so he wished it to be. A man dies suddenly, strychnine in his system, and every possible suspect conveniently within reach. He needed only to identify which of the assembled had motive enough to slip poison into a cup. Miss Marple, however, thought quite differently. She had watched the young inspector's confident stride, his notebooks filled with neatly ruled lines of questioning, and she had felt that small familiar pang, pity mixed with fond amusement. The police always started with facts, but facts, she had long learned, were rarely what they seemed. People were what mattered, their jealousies, their fears, their quiet lies told over tea. It was near noon when Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to Dr. Lacey. The doctor's surgery, a squat brick building just beyond the churchyard, smelled faintly of carbolic and old books. He greeted her kindly but looked tired. "Ah, Miss Marple, I might have guessed you'd take an interest in this unfortunate business." She smiled, the sort of gentle smile that disarmed even the most guarded. It is difficult not to be interested when one's host is so distressed, and one's holiday so rudely interrupted by tragedy. "I hear you examined Mr. Torrance." The doctor sighed. "Yes, indeed. There was no doubt of it. Strychnine, and in considerable quantity. Judging by the symptoms described by those present, death must have been almost immediate once it took hold." "Such a dreadful way to die," Miss Marple murmured. "So very unpleasant." "Quite so. Muscular convulsions, asphyxia. The poor fellow would have suffered." The doctor hesitated, then added, "It's the kind of poison one doesn't acquire by chance. Strychnine is restricted, you know. I keep a small supply for medicinal purposes, certain tonic mixtures, but it's carefully locked away." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she had brought out of habit, clicked softly. "I'm sure it is, and perhaps you've reason to believe it hasn't gone missing?" Dr. Lacey gave a short laugh. "Checked it myself last night, just in case. Not a grain unaccounted for." "Ah," she nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Then whoever administered it must have had access to another source. How curious. Such things are not easily come by in a place like this." The doctor rubbed his chin. "Indeed, unless someone brought it from elsewhere. Torrance, for instance, he was from London. One can purchase nearly anything in London." "True," said Miss Marple softly, "though I do wonder why a man would poison himself during tea at a friend's garden." The doctor chuckled ruefully. "You think it wasn't suicide, then? I seldom think people choose to die so publicly unless they mean to make a point," she said, "and Mr. Torrance didn't seem the sort for self-sacrifice. Vanity, yes. Drama, certainly. But despair? I hardly think so." Leaving the surgery, Miss Marple took the long way back, through the narrow lane leading to the cliffs. The tide was receding, leaving ribbons of wet sand that shimmered like glass. She stopped near the summer house where Julian Torrance had died. It had been roped off by the constable, but from a distance she could see the small details no one else seemed to notice. A single overturned chair beside the doorway, a cluster of crushed petals beneath the step, hydrangea blossoms, blue and bruised. She bent slightly, examining them. Someone had been standing here, perhaps waiting, perhaps watching. A soft rustle made her turn. Alice Brent stood a few feet away, her face pale against her dark dress. She looked as though she had not slept. "Miss Marple, I didn't mean to startle you. I just wanted to see it again. It doesn't feel real." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "It seldom does, my dear, not at first. But looking rarely helps. Memories are quite enough, don't you think?" Alice's eyes filled with tears. "They say the police are questioning Aunt Helena again. I heard them talking this morning. They think she put something in his tea." "But that's absurd, is it?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, not accusing. "Your aunt served him personally, did she not?" "Yes, but she served everyone." "Why would she do such a thing?" Julian admired her. "He said she reminded him of his mother. They were friends. Friendship can be complicated," Miss Marple replied gently, "particularly when money or affection becomes involved." Alice hesitated, then looked away toward the horizon. Inspector Graves said there was no sign of the poison anywhere else. Not in the sugar bowl, not in the teapot, only in Julian's cup. "Which suggests," said Miss Marple, "that it was placed there quite deliberately. But perhaps not by the hand we imagine." Alice frowned. "You think someone else?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In my experience, dear child, people rarely see what happens right under their noses. They see what they expect to see." The girl was silent, twisting her handkerchief. "There's something else I didn't tell the inspector," she said finally. "The morning before the tea, a letter came for Julian. I only noticed because he seemed upset by it. He went out walking straight after. When he came back, he was angry, almost frightened. I asked if something was wrong, and he said, 'Old debts have long shadows.' Then he laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh." "Did you happen to see the letter?" "No, he tore it up, but later, when I emptied the wastebasket in the sitting room, there was a corner left, a bit of heavy cream paper with a monogram, an M." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her mind sharpened instantly. For Millicent Harrow, perhaps. The lady in the photograph. When Alice had gone, Miss Marple lingered by the summer-house, thinking. A letter that upset him. An argument about money. A poison too deliberate to be accidental. It formed a picture, though still faint. She needed one more piece. That evening, at Helena Faraday's invitation, a few of the tea guests gathered for supper, partly out of sympathy, partly out of curiosity. The mood was subdued, but not without a certain thrill. Death, after all, lent drama to even the dullest social circle. Colonel Lacey blustered about police inefficiency, while his wife tutted and tried to silence him. Miss Hargreaves speculated darkly about artistic temperaments and romantic entanglements. Through it all, Helena sat like a fragile figurine, her hands clasped too tightly. Miss Marple observed her quietly. The older woman's distress seemed genuine, yet there was something held back, a flicker of calculation behind the trembling. When the conversation lulled, Miss Marple spoke softly. "My dear Mrs. Faraday, I noticed earlier a photograph of Mr. Torrance with a lady. Miss Harrow, was it? You said she was only a friend." Helena's eyes widened. "Yes, why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason. Only that the London papers sometimes mention her. A rather striking woman, I believe. I thought perhaps she might call or send a telegram when she hears the news." Helena's colour drained. I don't imagine she will." They hadn't spoken in years. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. How fortunate, then, that she no longer had reason to hold him to old promises. For a heartbeat, silence hung between them. Then the Colonel barked some fresh opinion, and the moment passed. But Miss Marple saw Helena's hand tremble as she lifted her glass. Not with fear, no, it was guilt, or perhaps recognition. Later, as the others departed, Miss Marple found herself momentarily alone with the maid, a quiet girl named Bessie, who seemed eager to please, yet frightened of her own shadow. "You've had a difficult few days, haven't you, my dear?" she said kindly. "Oh, yes, ma'am. I can hardly sleep. Poor Mr. Torrance. I was the one who washed his cup afterward. I wish I hadn't touched it." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "You washed it? I thought the police had taken everything." "Oh, they did, ma'am, later. But I'd already rinsed it when they came. I didn't know, you see. Mrs. Faraday told me to tidy up the garden before the inspector arrived." "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. "And tell me, did you notice anything odd about that cup before you washed it?" Bessie frowned. "Only that it didn't match the others. The rest had blue rims, but his was plain white. Mrs. Faraday said the others were in the wash, and fetched one from the cabinet inside." "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone soft but firm. "That was very helpful indeed." When she left Seaview Cottage that night, the moon was high and the air cool with salt. She walked slowly, her mind aligning the clues like neat stitches in a row. A mismatched cup, a letter signed M, an argument about money, and a hostess who fetched tea from indoors when others were served outside. By the time she reached her lodging, Miss Marple was certain of one thing. The truth of the Seaside Cottage murder was far more tangled than anyone imagined, and the hands that poured that fatal cup were not as innocent or as steady as they seemed. Morning broke soft and pale, with the first streaks of gold sliding across the windows of St. Mildred's, as though reluctant to disturb the uneasy peace that had settled there. The village still whispered of nothing but the death at Seaview Cottage, though by now the shock had begun to give way to speculation. People spoke less of tragedy and more of guilt. Whose? Exactly depended on whom one was speaking to. Mrs. Dacre, for instance, was certain it was Helena Faraday, while the Lacys suspected a servant, and Miss Hargreaves hinted darkly that artists and their sort were never to be trusted. Yet beneath the gossip lay something darker, a quiet fear that the poisoner might be one of them. Miss Marple took her breakfast by the bay window of her small lodging, her teapot steaming beside her and a slice of toast untouched on the plate. Her mind, as always, was quietly industrious. The small facts of the case had begun to settle like sediment in clear water, and she could now see the outlines forming beneath. A poisoned cup, a mismatched pattern, a hostess too pale, a letter torn but not forgotten, and a girl, Alice, caught in the middle of it all, too young to understand the webs that older hearts wove around her. She folded her napkin carefully and rose. The time had come, she thought, for a quiet word with Inspector Graves. She found him at the vicarage, where he sat at a cluttered table, the morning light revealing a certain weariness about his eyes. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mixture of politeness and mild exasperation. "Ah, Miss Marple, I suppose you've come to offer some observations?" "Only a few small ones," she replied, seating herself primly. "You see, I've always found that the smallest observations often prove the most useful, particularly when one is trying to understand people. And murder, after all, is a very human affair." Graves smiled tightly. "Quite. Though at the moment I'd prefer something more substantial than human nature. Evidence, for example." "Of course," she said mildly. "Then perhaps you'll indulge me for a moment while I speak of teacups." He blinked. "Teacups? Yes, you see, Mr. Torrance's cup was quite unlike the others. Plain white, when the others were rimmed in blue. Mrs. Faraday told her maid to fetch it from inside. A very small detail, Inspector, but then poison is usually found in small details." Graves frowned. "We noted the difference. It's hardly proof of anything. No, not proof, but indication. Someone chose that cup deliberately. The question, you see, is not merely who poured the tea, but who ensured that cup found its way to Mr. Torrance. The inspector rubbed his temples. "You think Mrs. Faraday switched it? I think she fetched it, but I do not think she understood what she was fetching." He looked at her sharply. "Then who did?" Miss Marple folded her hands. Perhaps someone who knew that Mrs. Faraday was fond of appearances, who knew she would wish her guest to have a matching set, but might, in her haste, take whatever was nearest at hand. Someone who understood her habits well enough to predict them. That requires intimacy, Inspector, not mere acquaintance. Graves hesitated, his brow furrowed. "You mean someone in the household?" "Indeed, and perhaps not only in the household, but in her confidence." As she rose to leave, she paused at the door. "You may wish to inquire, Inspector, who had access to Mrs. Faraday's china cabinet, and whether any of her cups have been replaced in recent days." He gave her a puzzled look, but she only smiled her gentle, inscrutable smile. "You see, people are rather like crockery. They appear whole until you look closely, and then you see the fine cracks beneath the glaze." That afternoon, St. Mildred seemed to hold its breath. The constable was seen walking briskly to and from Seaside Cottage. A rumour began that an arrest was imminent, but no arrest came. Helena Faraday remained in her house, receiving few visitors save Alice and Miss Marple. When Miss Marple arrived, she found Helena pacing before the hearth, her eyes fever-bright. "I can't bear it any longer," she said as soon as the older woman entered. "They think I killed him. Me! I could never have done such a thing." "Of course not, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, setting her bag on the side table. "But perhaps it would ease your mind if we spoke plainly. You knew Mr. Torrance quite well, didn't you?" Helena's hands twisted together. "He was a friend, a charming man. But he was difficult. He asked for money, you see. Said he was in trouble over a debt in London. I refused at first, but he insisted that I owed him something, that he'd done me a kindness once." "And had he?" Helena's eyes flickered. "Years ago, yes. When my husband died, I made some foolish investments. He helped me recover them, but lately he'd become demanding. I told him I couldn't give him more." "And that was the argument Alice overheard?" "Yes, he threatened to tell people lies about me. Said he'd write to the papers. It was cruel." She turned away, her voice trembling. "I thought he meant to frighten me. I never dreamed." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the letter from London, the one with the monogram M. Did you see it?" Helena's head snapped around. "What letter?" "The one he received the morning before he died. From a woman, I believe." For a moment, Helena's composure faltered. "Millicent Harrow," she whispered. "I knew about her. He said it was over, but he lied. He always lied. She wrote threatening letters. Said she'd expose him for a thief. He must have been desperate." "Desperate men do desperate things," Miss Marple murmured, "though sometimes it is others who act in their stead." Helena's gaze lifted sharply. "You think someone else killed him?" "I think someone believed they were protecting you," Miss Marple said softly. "Or perhaps protecting themselves." Helena's lips parted, but before she could answer, the door opened and Alice entered, pale and anxious. "Aunt Helena, the inspector's here again. He wants to speak with us both." Helena drew a shuddering breath and nodded. Miss Marple placed a steadying hand on her arm. "Do not worry, my dear. The truth, like cream, always rises to the top. One only needs patience." When Inspector Graves arrived, he looked far less certain than before. He nodded to Miss Marple with a mix of respect and resignation. "You were right, ma'am, about the cups. We found traces of powdered strychnine in the glaze of one of them, just enough to release when exposed to heat. Someone had rubbed it along the rim." Helena gasped. "But how? Who would do such a dreadful thing?" "That's what we mean to find out," said Graves. "The cabinet was unlocked, but Bessie, the maid, swears she never touched it. She says Miss Brent often helped with the washing up, though." All eyes turned to Alice. The girl froze, her face whitening. Me? I only helped after the garden tea, sometimes before if Aunt was tired. But I didn't. Oh, please, Inspector, I didn't. Miss Marple's voice was calm, even kind. Of course you didn't, my dear. But tell me, had you ever noticed one cup among the set that looked slightly different? Alice blinked. Yes, the plain one. Aunt said it came from another service. I used it once for cocoa, but it had a strange taste, so I put it back. I thought it was the detergent. Ah, Miss Marple said softly, her eyes sharpening. So it was there long before the tea. Graves stared at her. You mean the poison wasn't added that day? No, she said. It was waiting, placed there by someone who knew that at the right moment it would be used. Someone who had the patience to let chance play their part. Helena sank into a chair. But who could have known? Perhaps, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, someone who believed that sooner or later that cup would be used by the right person. And if it wasn't, well, the sea can hide many things. There was silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Alice whispered, Do you mean it wasn't meant for Julian? Miss Marple looked at her kindly. I think, my dear, it was meant for someone else entirely. Someone who drank tea every afternoon at Seaside Cottage, in that same garden, at that same table. Helena's eyes widened with sudden horror. Me, she breathed. It was meant for me. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Yes. The question now, my dear Mrs. Faraday, is not who hated Julian Torrance, but who hated you enough to let him die in your place. The room fell utterly still. Inspector Graves's pencil slipped from his hand. Outside, the waves broke faintly against the cliffs, as though echoing the quiet dread that now filled the house. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the hearth, her thoughts moving swiftly. There was pity in her heart, for Helena, for Alice, even for the foolish dead man. But there was also certainty. The noose was tightening, and somewhere close by, the true murderer was listening, knowing that Miss Marple had begun to draw the final thread. For a long moment after Miss Marple's quiet revelation, no one spoke. The words seemed to hang in the air of the drawing-room like smoke. Fine, invisible threads that clung to every surface, impossible to ignore. Helena Faraday sat motionless, her face drained of all colour, her eyes unfocused, as though she were seeing something terrible from a great distance. The sound of the sea through the half-open window seemed suddenly very loud. The long sighing of the waves rising and falling like a breath taken in fear. Inspector Graves was the first to recover. He straightened, his notebook forgotten. You mean to tell us, Miss Marple, he said, his voice low, that this wasn't a crime of opportunity, but of intention, that someone planned to kill Mrs. Faraday? Miss Marple nodded almost imperceptibly. Indeed, Inspector. Planned it carefully and patiently. It takes both knowledge and nerve to use poison in such a way. The cup was prepared beforehand, likely weeks ago, and placed back among the others. Whoever did so must have expected Mrs. Faraday to use it eventually. Fate, however, intervened, and Mr. Torrance drank from it instead. Helena gave a soft cry and buried her face in her hands. Alice rushed to her side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Aunt Helena, don't, please don't. Whoever did this, they'll be caught. Miss Marple will see to it. The old lady's eyes lifted toward Alice, full of gratitude tinged with confusion. But who would wish me harm, Jane? I've lived quietly all these years. I have no enemies. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. No one ever believes they do, my dear. Yet resentment has a way of ripening unnoticed, rather like fruit left too long in the sun. You have lived here a long while, Mrs. Faraday. Surely there are those who envy or misunderstand you. Helena shook her head weakly. "Oh, I suppose there are people who gossip, but that's nothing. The only person I ever quarrelled with was, well, there was old Mrs. Reeves years ago about a bit of land, but she's been dead these 10 years. The inspector scribbled a note, but looked unconvinced. Could there be anything financial? You mentioned earlier Mr. Torrance asked for money. Is there anyone else who might have expected an inheritance or benefit from you?" Helena hesitated. "Only Alice," she said softly. "She's my only living relative." All eyes turned instinctively toward the girl. Alice flushed crimson. "That's absurd. I'd never hurt Aunt Helena. She's been like a mother to me." Miss Marple intervened smoothly. "No one is suggesting such a thing, my dear. But tell me, were you the one who usually arranged the tea things? Mrs. Faraday mentioned you sometimes helped the maid." Alice nodded, still trembling. "Sometimes, yes. I'd fetch the china or carry the tray out to the garden. Aunt's hands aren't as steady as they used to be. But I never touched that cup, I swear. That cup, I swear." "That I quite believe you," Miss Marple said. "But it's curious, isn't it, that a cup used for cocoa some weeks ago should have such an unpleasant taste even then. It suggests the poison was already there, perhaps applied in dry form, waiting to dissolve. Whoever did so must have known the household well enough to predict its usage patterns. That narrows our circle considerably." Inspector Graves frowned. But if the intention was to kill Mrs. Faraday, why use such an elaborate method? Why not something simpler, like tampering with her food? "Because," said Miss Marple, "tea is ritual. It's habit. People trust the familiar gestures of everyday life. And murder, Inspector, often hides itself most easily in routine." The inspector nodded grimly. "Then we're looking for someone close. The maid, perhaps, or someone who visits often." Helena gave a faint moan. "No, Bessie wouldn't. She's been with me for years. She's simple, poor girl, but loyal." "Sometimes loyalty can be complicated," Miss Marple murmured. "I wonder, has she any family in the village?" Helena blinked. "Her brother works at the fish market, I believe. Her mother died some years ago." Miss Marple seemed to turn the information over carefully in her mind. And Bessie herself, was she fond of Mr. Torrance?" Helena looked surprised. "Fond of him? I don't think she even knew him." "Perhaps not well," Miss Marple said. "But servants see more than we imagine. A kind word or a smile from a handsome stranger can make quite an impression." At that moment, a knock came at the door, and Bessie herself entered carrying a tray with a fresh pot of tea. Her movements were timid but practised, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Shall I pour, ma'am?" she asked softly. "No, Bessie," Helena said hastily, her voice trembling. "Just leave it there, thank you." Bessie curtsied and turned to go. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way her hands twisted in her apron. The quick glance, she darted toward the inspector's notebook. Something flickered in the girl's expression. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. When the door closed, Miss Marple spoke quietly. "Inspector, may I suggest you have a look in Bessie's room? Not to accuse, mind you, merely to satisfy a little curiosity of mine." Graves hesitated. "You think she might have kept something?" "People often do," Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. "A token, a note, a keepsake. Poisoners, like sentimentalists, tend to hoard." Within the hour, Bessie's small attic room had been searched. She protested tearfully, insisting she'd done nothing wrong. And indeed, there was nothing immediately damning. Only a few trinkets, a worn Bible, and a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the lining of a drawer. Inspector Graves unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, written in a bold masculine hand. "My dearest B, you must do as I ask, or we are both lost. It will be simple if you remember the plan. Keep the cup safe. When the time comes, it will all be over, and I shall send for you. Trust me, and destroy this letter. Yours, J.T." The inspector stared, his face pale. Julian Torrance, he breathed. The man who died. Helena let out a strangled sound. He was using her. The poor, foolish girl. Miss Marple's expression was grave. Yes, I rather think he was. But perhaps not only using her. He must have realized Mrs. Faraday was no longer willing to pay his debts. Perhaps he planned to frighten her, make her ill, even appear to die, then reveal himself miraculously recovered and extract money under threat of scandal. But something went wrong. Graves looked up sharply. You mean he poisoned himself by accident? Not precisely, Miss Marple said. He set the snare for another and stepped into it himself. But there's more to it, Inspector. He may have coerced the girl into preparing the cup, yet someone else knew his plan and saw the opportunity to make it fatal. Someone else? Yes, someone who wanted both him and Mrs. Faraday gone. The first by mischance, the second by suspicion. It's a very clever way to rid oneself of two inconveniences at once. Helena stared at her, horror dawning. Jane, you don't mean... Miss Marple's gaze was soft but unflinching. I think, my dear, that we mustn't leap to conclusions. But I would very much like to speak to Miss Brent again. Alone, if you please. Alice looked bewildered. Me? But what have I done? Nothing yet, said Miss Marple kindly. Only talked. And talking, you know, has a way of revealing far more than we intend. The others withdrew reluctantly, leaving Miss Marple and the girl by the hearth. For a long while neither spoke. Then Miss Marple said, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, You loved him, didn't you, my dear? Alice's head bowed. Yes, she whispered. I thought he cared for me. He said we'd go away, start fresh in London. But then he laughed when I told him I'd spoken to Aunt Helena about it. He said she'd never let me go. And she wouldn't, of course, Miss Marple said gently. You're her only family. She's given you comfort, a home, a future. But you began to see her as the obstacle, not the benefactor. It happens more often than you think. Alice looked up sharply, eyes wide with terror. No, I didn't. No, of course you didn't pour the poison. Miss Marple interrupted softly. You didn't have to. You only knew that the cup was there, and that if Julian drank from it instead of your aunt, no one would ever suspect. You saw your chance for freedom, perhaps even a little revenge. Tears welled in the girl's eyes. I didn't mean for him to die, she said in a broken voice. I only wanted to frighten him. He was cruel. He said he'd ruin me if I didn't help him. Miss Marple sighed, her expression tender yet sorrowful. Yes, my dear, and now he's beyond all earthly ruin, while you must live with what remains. There's a kind of justice in that, though not the kind the law provides. Outside, the sound of the waves deepened, steady and unrelenting. Miss Marple rose slowly, smoothing the front of her dress. You must tell Inspector Graves everything. Concealment, you see, is the one thing time will not forgive, and time, like truth, has an inconvenient way of surfacing. When she stepped out into the fading light, the air smelled of salt and evening primrose. The sea, endless and watchful, stretched before her. Miss Marple looked toward it thoughtfully. The case, she knew, was not yet fully settled. There was still one secret unspoken, one hand unseen. But she could feel the current shifting. The pattern was almost complete. Only one thread remained to pull, and when it came loose, the entire tapestry would reveal itself at last. Evening fell heavy over St. Mildred's, wrapping the little seaside village in a damp, uneasy stillness. The wind had risen, carrying the sharp scent of brine and the distant thud of waves breaking against the cliffs. Within Seaview Cottage, every sound seemed amplified. The ticking of the hall clock, the faint hiss of the gas lamps, the creak of a door hinge somewhere upstairs. The house that had once been the pride of Helena Faraday's summers now felt like a mausoleum, holding its breath between revelation and ruin. Miss Marple sat alone in the small sitting-room, the remnants of tea untouched before her. Alice Brent had been taken to the vicarage under Inspector Graves's supervision, though not yet under arrest. The girl's confession, if it could be called that, had been halting and inconsistent. She had admitted to knowing of the poisoned cup, but denied applying the poison herself. She insisted Julian Torrance had orchestrated the plan, that she merely followed his instructions out of fear and infatuation. Yet something about her story troubled Miss Marple. The timing, the tone, it didn't quite fit the rhythm of human folly as Miss Marple had come to know it. The door opened softly behind her. Helena entered, her face wan and drawn, a shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. "They say she's confessed," she murmured. "Poor child! I can't imagine how she could have done such a thing." Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the fire. People do desperate things when they are frightened, my dear, and love, when it turns to fear, can drive one further than hatred ever could. Helena sank into the armchair opposite. "I should have seen it. She was restless lately, distracted. But I thought it was youth, romance, perhaps. Oh, Jane, if I had known." "You could not have known," Miss Marple said gently. "Even those closest to us keep parts of themselves hidden, but there is still something that does not ring true. Alice may have known about the cup, but I do not believe she poisoned it. She is too impulsive, too transparent. This was the work of patience. And patience in crime usually belongs to those with age or calculation on their side." Helena looked up, startled. "You mean someone else? Someone in the house?" "Someone nearby," Miss Marple corrected softly. "Someone who understood your habits well enough to predict that you would fetch that cup, that you would serve tea yourself, and that no one would question it. Helena's lips trembled. "But who could possibly hate me enough to wish me dead?" Miss Marple's eyes, bright and reflective as polished glass, rested on her. "That is what I have been asking myself. Tell me, my dear, you said earlier that Mr. Torrance helped you recover certain investments after your husband's death. Did anyone else know of that arrangement?" Helena frowned, thinking. "Only one person. My solicitor, Mr. Carver. He's handled my affairs for years. And Bessie, of course. She took some letters to the post for me." "Mr. Carver," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "Would that be Lionel Carver? The same family who once owned half the land around here?" Helena nodded. "Yes, though he's the last of them. His father lost most of the estate through bad speculation. Lionel manages well enough now, I think. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Her mind moved swiftly, recalling stray remarks she'd overheard at the grocer's weeks ago. Snatches of conversation about Carver's debts, about quiet sales of property, about a gentleman seen in Milchester more often than was seemly for one who claimed to work so hard. "Oh, no reason," she said at last, smiling faintly. "Only that men who handle other people's money sometimes forget which part belongs to whom." Helena frowned, perplexed. "Surely you don't think Lionel had anything to do with this? He's been a friend for years." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "But friendship and financial dependence make for uneasy bedfellows." Just then the doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. A few moments later, Inspector Graves entered, his coat spattered with sea mist. "Evening, ladies," he said briskly, though his face was tired. "We've got Miss Brent settled at the vicarage. I'm not pressing charges yet, not until we're sure how deep she was in it. But there's something else, something you'll want to see." He drew from his pocket a folded sheet of paper, slightly crumpled. "Found this among Julian Torrance's belongings when we went through his cottage again, hidden behind a loose board in his desk. Miss Marple took the paper and adjusted her spectacles. The handwriting was Torrance's, bold and self-assured, yet the words betrayed unease. Carver grows impatient, says the lady refuses to pay more. If she won't keep her end, he'll see her ruined. Claims she owes him for something past, something he can prove. I don't trust him, but I can't afford to cross him. He knows too much. Carver again, Miss Marple murmured. So our charming Mr. Torrance was not working alone after all, Graves nodded. That's what I thought. We went round to question Carver, but his clerk says he's gone to Milchester on business. Left this morning, hasn't been seen since. Convenient, Miss Marple said dryly. Men who flee seldom do so for business. Helena clutched the arm of her chair. You think Lionel was involved in Julian's blackmail? I think, said Miss Marple, that Lionel Carver had far more reason than Julian ever did. He handled your investments, didn't he? If Torrance discovered irregularities, perhaps a missing sum or two, and threatened to expose him, it would explain a great deal. Graves leaned forward. Then Carver poisons the cup, meaning for you to drink it, Mrs. Faraday, silencing both you and Torrance's leverage in one stroke. But Torrance takes the wrong cup, and the plan collapses. Precisely, Miss Marple said. Carver could not have foreseen that Mr. Torrance's vanity would lead him to swap cups for the sake of symmetry. A small gesture, but fate often hangs upon such trifles. Helena gave a faint gasp. Julian insisted we exchange cups. He said mine was prettier, and that he preferred the plain one. I remember now. Oh, how dreadful! Miss Marple rose slowly, smoothing her skirt. There is one more thing we must do, Inspector. You said Carver has gone to Milchester. He'll likely take the evening train to London. Men like that always believe distance will hide them. If we hurry, we might just intercept him. Within the hour, they were in Graves's motor car, the narrow road winding along the darkening cliffs. The air was sharp, the headlights cutting through drifting veils of mist. Helena insisted on coming, despite Miss Marple's gentle protests. She sat in silence, clutching her shawl, her face pale but resolute. They reached the small Milchester station just as the train's whistle pierced the fog. On the platform, a figure stood apart from the few waiting passengers. A tall man in a dark coat, glancing nervously down the track. When he saw the inspector striding toward him, he turned sharply, but it was too late. Graves caught his arm in a firm grip. "Going somewhere, Mr. Carver?" The man stiffened. "Inspector, this is outrageous. I have urgent business indeed," said Miss Marple, stepping forward. "Perhaps to discuss the unfortunate demise of Mr. Torrance, or to dispose of whatever records he might have kept regarding your more creative accountancy." Carver's composure cracked. His eyes darted toward Helena, then back to Miss Marple. "That woman ruined me," he spat suddenly. "She lived in comfort while my family's estate crumbled, and she dared to look down on me whose father she cheated." Helena recoiled. "That's a lie." Carver laughed bitterly. "Your husband bought our land for a pittance when my father was desperate. You called it business, I call it theft. I swore one day you'd pay it back." Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost sorrowful. "Revenge is a poor investment, Mr. Carver. It seldom yields the profit one imagines." Graves produced the letter from Torrance's desk. "You'll find this rather difficult to explain away." Carver's face blanched. He was supposed to frighten her, not die. The fool mixed too much, I think. I only meant to make her ill. Remind her what it feels like to lose everything. "Yet he drank from the wrong cup," Miss Marple said softly. "And now here you are, Mr. Carver, about to learn the same lesson in a different form." The inspector's men closed in, and within minutes Carver was led away, his defiance fading into muttered despair. Helena stood motionless, staring after him until the mist swallowed the last glimpse of his figure. On the drive back, no one spoke. The sea was a black sheet beside them, the wind carrying faint echoes of gulls. When they reached Seaview Cottage, Helena paused by the gate. "Jane," she said quietly, "how did you know it was him?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because, my dear, vengeance has a very particular scent. It is cold, not hot, planned, not passionate, and I have seen too many polite men like Mr. Carver, who mistake bitterness for justice." Helena's eyes filled with tears. "And Alice? She will recover," Miss Marple said gently. "The young often do. The heart learns through folly what wisdom would teach by patience." As she stepped inside, the old clock struck 10, and the house seemed at last to exhale. Miss Marple looked once toward the sea, calm now beneath the moonlight. In the gentle rhythm of the waves, she heard again the eternal pattern she knew so well. Greed, love, jealousy, pride, all weaving the same familiar tragedy beneath the surface of ordinary lives. And she, quiet as ever, merely listened, waiting for the next ripple to reach her shore. The following morning dawned pale and rain-streaked, as though the heavens themselves were weary after the night's grim revelations. St. Mildred's was unusually quiet. Word of Lionel Carver's arrest had spread, carried on the damp air, and whispered from one doorstep to another. To some, it brought relief, a sense that justice had been done. To others, it felt unfinished, as if the truth, like the sea, still hid something in its depths. And among those who sensed that silence carried more than it revealed was, of course, Miss Marple. She sat by her window in the small guest-house overlooking the beach, a pot of tea beside her and a letter half-written on the table. Outside, the sea heaved under the grey sky, restless and sullen. She had slept little. Though Carver's confession seemed to conclude the matter neatly enough, there lingered a discomfort, an untidy thread that refused to tuck itself away. It wasn't the confession itself. Carver's guilt was clear enough. What troubled her was his tone. He had spoken of revenge, of debt and pride, but not of the poisoned cup's origin. He had admitted to wanting Helena to suffer, but he had not described how he came to possess strychnine or how he learned to use it. He had even insisted, almost plaintively, that Torrance had mixed it himself. It was that insistence that nagged at her. Miss Marple knew when a lie was woven over a truth. Carver was angry, resentful, but not clever. He was the sort of man who plotted boldly and left his work untidy. The poisoned cup was not the mark of boldness. It was subtle, precise, and patient. A woman's work, if she were to be honest with herself. There came a gentle knock at her door. She rose, setting her teacup aside, and opened it to find Helena Faraday standing there, pale but composed, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. "Jane," she said softly, "may I come in?" "Of course, my dear. You look exhausted. I couldn't sleep. The storm kept me awake." Helena sank into the chair by the window, gazing absently at the grey horizon. "It's over, isn't it? Lionel will be tried, and Alice, well, the inspector says they won't charge her. She's young. They've taken her to stay with Mrs. Lacey for the time being." Miss Marple nodded. "That is very wise. She needs distance, and Mrs. Lacey is as good-hearted a soul as any to provide it." Helena gave a small, sad smile. "You've been our guardian angel in all this, Jane. Without you, I dread to think what might have happened." Miss Marple regarded her quietly, her eyes kind but searching. "Angels, my dear, only point the way. The rest depends on the living." She hesitated, then added, "I'm glad Alice is safe. But tell me, when you saw Lionel last, before all this began, Did he strike you as a man capable of such hatred?" Helena's expression faltered. "No, he was proud, certainly. Resentful, perhaps. But I thought it was mere talk. He spoke once about the past, about his father's losses, but I dismissed it as nostalgia. I never imagined—" She trailed off, shivering. "The past never really dies, does it?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "It lingers, especially when pride and money are involved. But there's still something missing. Carver may have wanted revenge, but I cannot see him as the hand that mixed poison into porcelain. That takes patience and precision, not temper." "He's a man of temper," Helena frowned. "Then you think someone helped him?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the rain-streaked window. "Perhaps not willingly, but someone, somewhere, knew more than they said." "Bessie, perhaps, Bessie," Helena repeated, startled. "Surely not. She adored this house. She would never harm me." Miss Marple sighed, rising to stir the fire. "Adoration, my dear, is a dangerous thing. When it curdles into resentment, it can be every bit as deadly as hate." Later that morning, Miss Marple walked to Seaview Cottage, her umbrella held firmly against the wind. The house stood silent, the garden drenched, the summer house at the end of the path looking forlorn beneath its veil of ivy. Bessie was sweeping the kitchen floor when Miss Marple entered. She started visibly at the sight of her. "Oh, miss, you gave me such a fright. I thought everyone had gone to the inquest." "I prefer a quieter morning," Miss Marple said pleasantly, removing her gloves. "Tell me, Bessie, how have you been managing? It must be lonely here now that the inspector and his men have gone." Bessie nodded nervously. "It is, ma'am, but I'm glad it's all finished. I can't bear to think of poor Mr. Torrance. Such a terrible way to go." Miss Marple watched her hands, how they trembled ever so slightly as she twisted the hem of her apron. "You knew Mr. Torrance, didn't you, Bessie, before he came here?" The girl froze. "Me, ma'am? No, never. Why would I?" "Oh, my dear, don't trouble to deny it. He wrote you a letter. You kept it hidden. Inspector Graves found it in your drawer. But there's something peculiar about that letter, isn't there? The ink is smudged in places, and the handwriting uneven, as though someone else tried to copy his style. The inspector didn't notice, but I did." Bessie's face went white. I didn't know what it meant, miss. I only did what I was told." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And who told you, Bessie?" The girl's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't Mr. Carver, ma'am, I swear. It was Miss Alice." Miss Marple said nothing for several seconds, only the faint ticking of the clock filling the silence. "Go on," she said at last. "She came to me one afternoon before the garden party, said she needed a favour. She'd found one of the cups was chipped and asked if I could take it away to be mended. When I said I couldn't, she told me not to bother, that she'd fix it herself. Later she gave it back to me and told me to put it with the rest. I thought nothing of it, miss. She was so kind, always sweet with me. I didn't think, oh dear Lord, I didn't think—" Miss Marple laid a hand on her arm. There, you couldn't have known. But I fear Alice knew more than she ever confessed. Not about poison, perhaps, not in the beginning, but enough to sense that Mr. Torrance's scheme could be turned to her advantage." Bessie sobbed quietly. "You mean she wanted him to die?" Miss Marple's expression was sorrowful. "No, I think she wanted to be free, but freedom purchased in fear seldom brings happiness." Leaving Bessie to her tears, Miss Marple stepped out into the garden. The rain had eased, and the sea shimmered faintly beyond the mist. She walked to the summer house, where the ivy leaves still clung damply to the frame. There, half buried in the soil near the threshold, she noticed something glinting faintly. A small metal clasp, broken and rusted. She knelt to pick it up. It was part of a bracelet, a trinket of cheap silver. She recognized it instantly. She had seen it before on Alice Brent's wrist, the day of the garden tea. She turned the piece over in her gloved hand, thoughtful. The clasp was snapped, not unhooked. A struggle then, brief but real, and yet no one had ever mentioned one. She rose slowly, her mind working through the possibilities. If Alice had been near the summer house at the moment Torrance died, perhaps she had not come upon him by accident. Perhaps she had followed him, hoping to speak with him, or to silence him. That evening, Miss Marple called upon Inspector Graves at the vicarage. He looked weary, his desk littered with papers. "Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his temples, "I hope you're not about to tell me we've arrested the wrong man." "Not quite," she replied mildly. "Mr. Carver was guilty of planning harm, yes. But the final act, the cup, the letter, the opportunity, those belong to another. I believe Miss Brent played a greater part than we imagined." Graves stared. "But she confessed only to knowing about the cup." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "Confessions often reveal more by what they omit. She said she wanted to frighten him, that he'd threatened to ruin her. But what if she met him in the summer house to plead, or to threaten him herself? What if he mocked her, refused her? A frightened girl might strike, even without intending murder. The clasp I found by the summer house suggests there was a struggle. Perhaps she tried to take something from him. A letter, evidence, and in the chaos the poison took hold. The cup may have been his, but the moment was hers." Graves sank back, the truth dawning slowly across his features. "Good Lord, you mean she didn't just find him dead? She was there when it happened." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And that is the part she will never confess, because she believes fate itself did the work for her." The inspector exhaled heavily. "We'll have to question her again." Miss Marple nodded, her face serene yet grave. "Be gentle, Inspector. She is guilty of foolishness, not malice. Life will punish her enough." As she walked back through the quiet streets, the mist thickened, swallowing the outlines of the cottages and the sound of the sea. In the distance, church bells began to toll, slow and mournful. Miss Marple paused to listen, the faintest smile touching her lips. Justice, she thought, was seldom neat, but it had a way of finding its form, shaped not by the courts or constables, but by the quiet reckoning of human hearts. The next morning broke with a pale shimmer of light that crept cautiously over the rooftops of St. Mildred's, spilling into windows like an unwanted guest. The storm had passed, but it left behind the damp hush of something unsettled, as though the village itself waited to hear what new truth would come crawling out of the sea. Miss Marple rose early, her sleep having been brief and troubled. She had dreamt of waves swallowing footprints in the sand, clues erased before anyone could read them. By the time she made her way to the vicarage, Inspector Graves was already pacing in the garden, coat unbuttoned, cigarette forgotten between his fingers. He looked up at her arrival, relief and uncertainty written plainly across his young face. "Miss Marple," he said, "I was just about to send for you. We questioned Miss Brent again last night, as you suggested." "And?" she asked quietly, settling herself on the bench beneath the old yew tree. She admitted she met Torrance in the summer house before the tea, said she went to beg him to leave the village, that she couldn't bear the lies any longer. She claims he laughed at her, called her childish. They argued. Then he drank his tea and she turned away. When she looked back, he was dying. Graves exhaled, shaking his head. "She swears she didn't touch the cup." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Perhaps she didn't, but guilt doesn't always come from action. Sometimes it's born from silence," he frowned. "You mean she let him die?" "She might have. Or she might have realized too late that her wish, spoken in anger or fear, had been granted by someone else's hand. It is often the innocent who carry the heaviest conscience." The inspector was silent for a long moment, watching a gull swoop low across the grey sky. "It's a terrible business," he said finally, "but I think we've reached the end of it. Carver will stand trial for conspiracy and blackmail, and the girl, well, she'll have to live with what she's done." Miss Marple gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," she said softly, "that is punishment enough, I think." Later that morning, she returned to Seaview Cottage to see Helena. The air inside was heavy with the scent of damp wood and faintly of lavender polish. Helena sat by the hearth, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze unfocused. She had aged, Miss Marple thought, not in years, but in spirit. The events of the past week had drained her of something vital, leaving her quieter, almost translucent. "They've taken Alice to stay with Mrs. Lacey," Helena said, her voice thin. "She's safe there, thank heaven. Poor child. She looked so lost when the inspector came. And yet—" she hesitated, glancing up. "Do you think she truly meant to harm him? I think she meant to free herself," Miss Marple said gently. "But freedom taken in fear always leaves chains behind. She loved a man who used her, and despised a woman who sheltered her. That is a cruel combination." Helena shivered. "It's strange, isn't it? How evil grows from such small beginnings. A letter here, a lie there, and suddenly a life is gone." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her tone soft but steady. "Evil often begins in trifles. It's like dust. It settles unnoticed until it dulls everything it touches." She rose, crossing to the window. The garden beyond looked deceptively serene. Only the summer-house, now shuttered and cordoned by the constable's tape, bore silent witness to what had passed. "Do you mean to stay here, my dear?" she asked after a pause. Helena sighed. "I don't know. The house feels haunted. Not by ghosts, but by memories. Every teacup, every chair seems to whisper." Miss Marple turned to her. "Then perhaps a change would do you good. A visit to London or Bath. Somewhere with music and chatter. St. Mildred's has had quite enough silence." Helena smiled faintly. "Perhaps you're right. And you, Jane? Will you stay much longer?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her tone remained serious. "Only until I've finished my knitting and my thinking." That afternoon the sun broke briefly through the clouds, and the village stirred again. Fishermen mended their nets by the quay. Children chased each other along the damp lanes, and for a moment life resumed its comforting rhythm. Yet beneath that calm there was still curiosity. People spoke in lowered voices at the shop and church, wondering what truly happened at Seaview Cottage, each embellishing the tale in their own way. Miss Marple heard snatches as she passed. That Helena had poisoned her own guest, that Alice had done it for love, that the London novelist had been a spy. St. Mildred's thrived on imagination. She spent the evening walking along the promenade, her shawl wrapped tightly against the breeze. The tide was receding, leaving behind a scatter of shells and driftwood. As she reached the bend near the cliffs, she saw someone standing by the railing. A small figure, slight and familiar. It was Alice Brent. The girl turned as Miss Marple approached, her eyes red from crying, but her posture rigid with defiance. "They said you'd come," she murmured. "Inspector Graves, I mean. He told me you wanted to speak to me before I left." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, my dear. I thought it only fair that you should hear the truth as it stands. Not from gossip, but from understanding." Alice gave a bitter laugh. "Understanding? You think you understand me?" Miss Marple's voice was calm. "I understand fear and loneliness. They make strange companions. You believed you could trust Julian Torrance, and when you discovered you couldn't, you felt trapped. That's what drove you to the summer house, isn't it? Alice's lips trembled, but she said nothing. "He was cruel to you," Miss Marple went on softly. "He promised things he never meant to give, and when you saw he intended to use you against your aunt, you wanted to stop him. Perhaps you hoped to reason with him, perhaps to threaten him. But when he laughed at you, when he called you foolish, you felt something break inside. You didn't poison him, but you didn't call for help either. You stood there and watched the man who'd ruined your peace choke on his own deceit." The girl's composure shattered. "Stop it! Please, don't—" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "There's no shame in truth, my dear. You didn't plan his death, but you let it happen, and that is a burden you will carry. Still, it is not the end. People can change if they are brave enough to see what they've done." Tears ran freely down Alice's cheeks. "What will they do to me?" "The law will show mercy," Miss Marple said. "Inspector Graves knows the difference between wickedness and weakness. So do I." They stood in silence for a while, the wind lifting the girl's hair, the sea murmuring below. Finally Alice whispered, "I loved him, you know, even at the end. Isn't that stupid?" "Not stupid," Miss Marple said kindly. "Only human. We all love the wrong people at least once. The lesson is to learn why." When the girl finally turned away, walking slowly toward the village, Miss Marple remained at the railing, gazing out to where the sun was sinking into the sea. The light shimmered over the water, fragile and fleeting, like forgiveness itself. That evening, back at the guest house, she found a letter waiting on her dressing table. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting unfamiliar but elegant. She broke the seal and read the brief message inside. "My dear Miss Marple, I leave St. Mildred's tonight. Thank you for your kindness, and for seeing more than I could bear to admit. I shall try to live honestly now wherever I go. You were right. Truth, though it hurts, is the only freedom left to us." Baby Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her eyes glistening in the lamplight. She placed it beside her knitting and sat down, the click of her needles soon filling the quiet room. The pattern grew steadily under her fingers, intricate, symmetrical and inevitable, much like life itself. Outside, the sea sighed against the shore, washing away the last traces of footprints on the sand. St. Mildred's was returning, slowly, to its old peace. But Miss Marple knew that peace in any village was merely the pause between secrets, and as she watched the flame dance in the hearth, her thoughts wandered, not to guilt or innocence, but to the quiet constancy of human folly. For wherever hearts beat and tongues wagged, there would always be mysteries to unravel, and Miss Marple, ever patient, would be waiting to untangle them one thread at a time. The next few days passed with deceptive calm, like the sea after a storm that still hides dangerous currents beneath its glossy surface. St. Mildred's returned to its daily rhythms. Church bells at 7, gossip by 10, and the clatter of teacups by 4. But a strange stillness lingered over Seaview Cottage. The police had come and gone. The reporters had retreated, and yet Miss Marple, who had planned to leave that week, found herself unable to pack. Something in the air remained unfinished, and she, being who she was, could not abide untidy conclusions. On the third evening after Alice Brent's departure, Miss Marple was taking her usual walk along the cliff path when she saw a figure hurrying down toward the cove. At first she thought it might be one of the fishermen returning late, but as the mist shifted she recognized Helena Faraday's shawl fluttering in the wind. The older woman moved quickly, too quickly for her usual grace, and the way she clutched a small parcel close to her chest stirred unease in Miss Marple's heart. Without hesitation, she followed, keeping to the edge of the path until it dipped toward the beach. The tide was low, the sand glistening like tarnished silver. And Helena stood near the water's edge, stooping to place the parcel among the rocks. Miss Marple approached quietly, her voice carrying over the rush of the surf. "My dear Mrs. Faraday, what are you doing out here so late?" Helena started, straightening at once. "Jane, you frightened me." I came to throw away some things. Old letters, mostly. I thought it best to be rid of them. Miss Marple's eyes, though kind, missed nothing. "Letters, you say? From whom?" Helena hesitated, then forced a small smile. "From Julian. He wrote to me long before all this nonsense began. They're of no consequence now." The answer was too rehearsed. Miss Marple stepped closer. "You mean before his death? How curious that you should keep them hidden until now." Helena's fingers tightened on the parcel. "I only wanted to put the past behind me." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but the past, my dear, has a habit of refusing to stay buried, especially when it was never quite honest to begin with." For a long moment, only the wind answered them. Then Helena gave a low, trembling laugh. "You've always been too perceptive for comfort, Jane. I suppose there's no point pretending with you." She looked out toward the horizon, where the sun had begun to sink. "You were right about Lionel. He despised me. But you were wrong about something else. He wasn't the only one who wanted Julian dead." Miss Marple remained still. "No, I did too," Helena whispered. "Not in thought, perhaps, but in wish. Every time that man smiled, I felt myself weaken. He reminded me of my husband, so charming, so certain. When he came asking for money, I should have turned him out. Instead, I gave him tea. And poison?" Helena's head turned sharply. "No, I never touched it. But I knew about it, Jane. I knew that cup was dangerous." The wind seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of the waves. "You knew?" Miss Marple repeated quietly. "Yes, Lionel told me." Helena's voice shook now, the words tumbling out like confession. "He came to me the week before the tea, said he could help rid me of Julian once and for all. He brought the cup, told me to keep it aside and that no one else need ever know. I was horrified, but I didn't stop him. I told myself I'd never use it. I locked it away. But the day of the tea, oh, Jane, I don't know what came over me. The sight of Julian sitting there, laughing with Alice, sneering behind those eyes. I felt trapped. So I fetched the cup. Just for him, I thought. But when he asked to switch, her voice broke. I let him drink from it." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but there was a deep sorrow in her eyes. "You let fate choose, then, and you've been living with that choice ever since." Helena nodded helplessly, the parcel slipping from her grasp. "I couldn't bear to tell anyone. The police, Alice, even you. It was my silence that killed him, as much as Lionel's spite. I thought if I destroyed the letters, perhaps I could destroy the memory too." Miss Marple stooped, picking up the damp parcel before the tide could claim it. "Burn them at home, my dear," she said gently. "The sea keeps secrets poorly." They walked back together in silence, the cliffs rising dark around them. When they reached the cottage, Helena sank into the chair by the fire, exhausted. Miss Marple placed the parcel on the hearth and touched a match to it. The flame caught slowly, curling the edges of the paper until the ink turned to smoke. When it was done, Helena whispered, "Do you think I'll be forgiven?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is not for me to decide. But confession, even delayed, is a kind of grace. It lightens the soul, though it cannot undo the past." The next day, Inspector Graves arrived to collect a final statement. Miss Marple told him only what was necessary, that Helena had admitted to knowing of the poison, but not applying it, that her silence had been cowardice, not malice. Graves listened without interruption. So the whole dreadful chain began with Carver's bitterness, continued through Torrance's greed, and ended with Mrs. Faraday's fear. He said at last, 3 sins, 3 victims. God help them all. Miss Marple inclined her head. And perhaps a 4th, Inspector, the sin of pride. It lies beneath all the others. He nodded, grim but respectful. Will you be leaving us now, Miss Marple? Soon, she replied. I think St. Mildred's has had enough of me. But she stayed one last evening, strolling through the village as twilight deepened. At the harbour, she paused to watch the fishermen preparing their boats for the next morning's tide. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the cottages, and somewhere a piano played a hesitant tune. For all its shadows, St. Mildred's was still a place of life, and that comforted her. As she turned to go, she saw Bessie walking down the lane, her apron folded neatly, her expression subdued. The girl stopped when she saw Miss Marple. "Ma'am," she said softly, "Mrs. Faraday's leaving tomorrow. She said she couldn't have done it without you." Miss Marple smiled. "Tell her I wish her peace. And you, Bessie, be kind to yourself. We can only live forward, never backward." Bessie nodded, her eyes glistening. "Do you think the village will ever forget?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Villages never forget, but they do learn to hush the sharpest memories. Time dulls the edges." That night, as she packed her belongings, she paused by the window to look once more at the sea. The moon cast a path of light across the water, steady and unbroken. She thought of Helena, of Alice, of the poor foolish men who had played their parts and paid their prices. Humanity, she mused, was endlessly complex, its sins born as often from frailty as from cruelty. And though she had seen the worst of it many times, she could never quite lose faith in the small redemptions that followed tragedy. The next morning, she boarded the coach bound for St. Mary Mead. As it wound up the hill, she looked back one last time. Seaview Cottage stood in the distance, its white walls gleaming faintly in the dawn light. The garden seemed peaceful again, the hydrangeas blue and full, their petals opening toward the sun. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. "Poor creatures," she murmured. "They'll bloom again next year, just as they always do. People could learn something from flowers. They survive the storm, even when the roots are shaken." And as the road turned inland, the sea vanished from view, leaving behind only the whisper of waves and the faint scent of salt in the air. An ending as gentle and inevitable as Miss Marple herself. The journey from St. Mildred's to St. Mary Mead was a quiet one. The landscape rolled past in muted greens and soft grey skies, the sort of English melancholy that seemed to cleanse rather than sadden. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resting idly in her lap, her eyes following the fields as though searching them for answers still unspoken. The case, if such it could be called, was over. The guilty had been named, the innocent protected, and the dead mourned. Yet Miss Marple, who understood the secret rhythms of the human heart better than any inspector or coroner, knew that resolution and truth were not always the same thing. When she reached home, the familiarity of her little garden soothed her. The hollyhocks standing proud, the roses still bravely blooming despite the season's turn. She set down her bag, fed her cat, and brewed herself a pot of tea. All was in its proper place again, yet her mind wandered still to St. Mildred's. Helena Faraday's quiet confession, Alice's trembling repentance, Lionel Carver's bitter end, each piece of the tragedy fit, yet the pattern they formed was not quite whole. There had been something too simple about it all, too neatly concluded for comfort. Miss Marple had learned long ago that life seldom resolved itself like a tidy detective story. Her suspicions were not entirely baseless. 2 mornings later, a letter arrived, postmarked from St. Mildred's by the Sea. The handwriting was fine and elegant, unfamiliar but precise. She slit it open with her little silver knife and read, "Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you well and safely home. There is one more thing you ought to know, something that has troubled me since you left. I cannot bear to keep it to myself any longer. Come if you can to Seaside Cottage. I will be here until Sunday. Please, for both our sakes, come quickly. Yours faithfully, Helena Faraday." Miss Marple folded the letter and stared out the window. A faint wind stirred the lace curtains, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and rain. She read the letter again. The tone was restrained but urgent, less the plea of a woman in distress than that of one who had made a decision. And decisions, in Miss Marple's experience, were rarely without consequence. She arrived in St. Mildred's the following afternoon, the coach winding once more down toward the shining sea. The village looked unchanged, but there was a subdued air, as if it had grown tired of its own gossip. When she reached Seaside Cottage, Bessie opened the door, her eyes wide with surprise and something like relief. "Oh, Miss Marple, Mrs. Faraday said you might come, though I didn't think you'd so soon. She's in the garden, ma'am, by the summer-house." Miss Marple nodded and stepped inside. The house was quieter than before, stripped of its tension, yet filled with a kind of watchful peace. She followed the familiar path through the garden, where the hydrangeas still bloomed pale blue against the hedge. Helena stood near the summer-house, wrapped in a dark shawl despite the mild day. She turned as Miss Marple approached, and for a moment her expression softened into a weary smile. "Jane, you came, of course," Miss Marple said gently. "Your letter gave me little choice." Helena gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh. "I suppose it did. I've thought of little else since you left. You see, I couldn't rest, not after what I remembered. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Remembered?" Helena's hands trembled as she gestured toward the summer-house. "That day. There's something I forgot to tell you, something that's haunted me since. After Julian drank the tea and began to, well, after it began, I didn't only run for help. I went back." Miss Marple remained silent, her gaze never leaving Helena's face. "I went back," Helena continued, "because I'd left my brooch on the table. A small thing, but it was my mother's, and I couldn't bear to lose it. When I reached the doorway, Julian was still alive. He was trying to speak. He said one word, 'Letter.' At the time I thought he meant the one from Millicent Harrow. But now I'm not sure. The letter he wrote to Bessie?" Miss Marple asked. Helena shook her head. "No, another. I think he left one for me." She reached into the folds of her shawl and produced a crumpled envelope, yellowed and creased. "I found this yesterday, hidden behind the drawer of his writing desk. I don't know why I didn't look sooner." Miss Marple took the letter carefully and unfolded it. The writing was unmistakably Julian's, bold, looping, with that faint arrogance that had marked even his speech. "My dearest H, by the time you read this, I may have done something unforgivable. Lionel has forced my hand. He means to expose both of us unless I comply with his demands. He has the documents proving the transfers you made under my name, your late husband's accounts, the missing securities. I thought to protect you, but it seems I have only ensnared us both. If anything happens to me, know that it was not Carver alone who ruined me. There was another far closer than I ever guessed." There the letter ended abruptly, the final word trailing off as if interrupted. Miss Marple read it twice before looking up. "Far closer than he ever guessed," she repeated quietly. "That's a curious phrase. You've told me everything about Lionel and yourself. Who else could it mean?" Helena's face had gone pale. I don't know. Unless— Oh no, Jane, surely not. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. Unless, perhaps, it refers to someone within your household. Someone who had access to both your papers and his. Bessie? Helena whispered. No, Miss Marple said gently. Not Bessie. She is too simple and too frightened of consequence. But think, who else came and went freely? Who was both devoted to you and in Mr. Torrance's confidence? Helena drew a sharp breath. Alice, but she couldn't have. Miss Marple's tone was soft but firm. Oh, couldn't she? She was cleverer than you gave her credit for. She played the innocent child to perfection. But behind it was resentment. A resentment deeper than you ever imagined. She depended on you, yes, but she also despised the dependence. And when Julian appeared, offering her escape, she saw her chance. Yet she also knew his vanity, his recklessness. When she realized he was using her, perhaps even mocking her, she turned her anger elsewhere. Toward you. Helena shook her head, trembling. You think she meant to ruin me? I think she meant to be free of both of you, Miss Marple said. By helping Torrance, she could see you fall. By betraying him, she could erase her guilt. It is a dangerous thing, my dear, when youth learns deceit too early. Helena sank into the nearest chair, her strength spent. Then she'll come back, she murmured. She'll come back for the rest of the letters. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the house, where a faint sound, a door closing, echoed through the stillness. She rose at once, her voice calm but edged with steel. I rather think she already has. They found Alice in the drawing-room, standing beside the writing desk, her gloved hands trembling as she held a small bundle of papers. Her face, when she turned, was pale but defiant. I thought you'd gone, she said, her voice flat. But of course you haven't. You never leave until it's done, do you, Miss Marple? Miss Marple regarded her sadly. One must tidy the threads, my dear. You, of all people, should understand that. Alice gave a bitter laugh. You think you're so clever. You don't know what it's like. To live under someone else's charity, to be watched, pitied, managed. Aunt Helena had everything, and she still called me her little orphan as though I were a child. And so you decided to punish her, Miss Marple said gently. I only wanted her to see what it felt like, Alice said, her voice rising. Julian was supposed to help me, but he was worse. He made me laugh at her behind her back, called her a fool, took her money. When I realized what he'd done, I told him I'd expose him. He said he'd write to her first, tell her everything, and then he laughed. He said she'd never believe me over him. So yes, I switched the cups. I thought it poetic somehow, but I didn't know it would be so fast. The words hung in the air, fragile and terrible. Helena covered her face, silent tears slipping through her fingers. Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, was low and steady. You should go with the inspector, my dear. He will come soon. It is always better to face the truth while one can still stand. Alice's eyes flickered, defiance giving way to despair. The papers fell from her hand like withered leaves. It doesn't matter, she whispered. Nothing ever does. When the police took her away, Helena sat unmoving for a long time. Miss Marple poured tea and waited, patient as ever. At last Helena spoke. She was my sister's child, Jane. My last family. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, and perhaps in the end that was her tragedy as well as yours. Love, when twisted by pride, is the deadliest poison of all. As evening fell over the sea, Miss Marple looked out from the garden once more. The tide had risen, washing gently against the rocks, erasing the footprints of those who had come and gone. And in that eternal rhythm she saw again the pattern of the world, its cruelties, its mercies, and its small, enduring moments of grace. The following morning was pale and still, as though the world itself were holding its breath after the previous day's revelations. The sea outside Seaview Cottage stretched calm and silvery, its quiet surface belying the storms that had passed, both upon the water and within the hearts of those who lived beside it. Inside, Helena Faraday sat in her drawing-room, staring into the dying embers of the hearth. She had slept little. Every time her eyes closed, she saw Alice's face as she had been led away, pale, defiant, and at the last heartbreakingly young. The echo of that final moment would not leave her. Miss Marple, who had remained the night at the vicarage, came calling soon after breakfast. She entered quietly, as was her way, and found Helena still in her dressing-gown, her tea untouched on the table beside her. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "you must try to eat something. The living require strength to endure what the dead, and the gone, cannot." Helena gave a wan smile that flickered and died. "It's strange, Jane. I spent my life believing that kindness could cure anything. I gave Alice everything, home, comfort, even love. And in the end, it was all that I gave that destroyed her. How does one make peace with that?" "One doesn't," Miss Marple said gently, taking a seat beside her. "One merely learns to forgive without understanding. Some hearts are built to break against the hands that feed them. Alice was lost long before she came to you." Helena closed her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "She said she wanted me to see what it felt like, to be laughed at, to be pitied. I had no idea she felt that way." Miss Marple watched the firelight glint on the silver frame atop the mantel, the photograph of Helena and Alice in happier days. "Children often mistake protection for imprisonment," she said, "and those who are dependent learn early how to wound those they depend upon. It is their only weapon." There was a long silence. Outside, a gull cried faintly, and the clock ticked its steady rhythm. At last Helena said, "They'll take her to London, won't they? To stand trial?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Inspector Graves will see that she is treated fairly. Her youth and the confusion of her circumstances will weigh in her favour. I dare say she will not be condemned harshly." Helena's eyes filled. "And afterward?" Miss Marple hesitated, then said quietly, "Afterward, life will teach her more than any punishment could. That is the cruel mercy of time." Helena rose and moved to the window, gazing out toward the garden. The hydrangeas were beginning to fade now, their colours softening from blue to ghostly grey. "I think I shall leave St. Mildred's, Jane. The house feels too full of shadows. Perhaps I'll go abroad for a while. Italy, maybe. The air there has a way of forgiving what England cannot. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A change of air does wonders. And yet, my dear, you will find that shadows travel lightly. They follow only where memory leads." Helena turned, her expression gentle but resigned. "Then perhaps I must learn to live with mine." That afternoon, Miss Marple took her leave of Seaview Cottage for the last time. The villagers watched from doorways as she passed, whispering to one another in that half-awed, half-fond way people reserve for those who have seen too much and understood it all. Even the postmaster, who prided himself on knowing everything first, only shook his head when she smiled at him. "Another sad story, Miss Marple," he said. "Though I suppose you've seen worse." She inclined her head. "The world is never short of sorrow, Mr. Berwick. But it is also full of small kindnesses, if one remembers to look for them." The coach departed at 3:30, carrying her away from the sea and the scent of salt and flowers. As the road climbed the hill, she looked back once more. Seaview Cottage gleamed faintly in the distance, white against the dark sweep of the cliffs, its chimneys thin and still against the sky. For a moment she fancied she saw Helena standing in the garden, her shawl caught in the wind, waving faintly as though to bid her farewell. Then the view vanished, swallowed by a bend in the road. She returned to St. Mary Mead by evening. The little village was just as she had left it, peaceful, drowsy, and faintly curious. Miss Hartnell called across the lane to ask if she'd solved another of those dreadful crimes, while the grocer's boy nearly ran his bicycle into a hedge in his eagerness to hear her reply. Miss Marple smiled, deflecting the attention as easily as one might brush away a fly. "Oh, nothing so dramatic," she said. "Only a matter of human misunderstanding." That night, sitting once again in her familiar parlour, she took out her knitting and let her thoughts wander. The fire crackled softly, the clock chimed 9, and the cat purred contentedly by her feet. She thought of the people of St. Mildred's, their fears, their follies, their hidden shames, and of how similar they were in truth to those of St. Mary Mead. Human nature did not vary much from place to place, only the scenery changed, and yet something in this last case lingered differently. Perhaps it was Helena's quiet dignity, or Alice's bitter despair, or perhaps it was the realization that even the gentlest of souls could carry within them the seeds of destruction, planted not by malice, but by love itself. That, Miss Marple thought, was the real tragedy, that good intentions so often paved the road to ruin. The following morning, a knock at the door interrupted her reflections. She opened it to find a familiar figure. Inspector Graves, looking somewhat travel-worn, but relieved. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple," he said, doffing his hat. "I was on my way back from London, and thought I'd bring you the latest news. About Miss Brent." Miss Marple gestured for him to come in. "You'll take tea, of course," he smiled faintly. "You always know how to improve a man's day." Once seated, he accepted a cup and said, "They've decided not to try her for murder. Manslaughter, perhaps, if that. The evidence of premeditation was too slight. The magistrate believes she acted under strain, and there's talk of sending her to a home for moral rehabilitation. Not prison." Miss Marple nodded. "A merciful outcome. I hope she finds some measure of peace." Graves sighed. "She's a clever girl, you know. I almost pity her." "Cleverness unguided by conscience is a dangerous gift," Miss Marple said quietly. "But youth has its advantage. It can still learn." He rose to go, glancing at the neat rows of roses beyond the window. "You've a calm life here, Miss Marple. I envy it sometimes," she smiled. "Calm on the surface, perhaps. But even in St. Mary Mead, human nature finds its little amusements." After he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. The village was bathed in late afternoon light, children's laughter drifting from the green. She took up her knitting again, the rhythm soothing and precise. The pattern was nearly complete now. Soft blue wool threaded with pale grey. It reminded her, oddly, of the sea at St. Mildred's. As she worked, she reflected on how each life was a kind of pattern, woven from choices, mistakes, and chance. Some were tangled, some smooth, some abruptly ended, but all in their way told a story. Helena Faraday's life would continue, shadowed yet still graceful. Alice's would begin anew, painful but perhaps not hopeless, and Miss Marple's own would go on much as before, marked by quiet observation, gentle meddling, and a faith that even in tragedy there lingered the possibility of redemption. When dusk fell, she rose to draw the curtains. For a moment she paused, catching sight of the sky streaked with rose and gold. The world, she thought, had an extraordinary way of healing itself. Time softened edges, blurred scars, and folded the past into something bearable. And in that thought she found comfort, not in justice alone, but in the steady, unending rhythm of life itself. She turned back to the hearth, the fire burning low, and set her knitting neatly aside. The evening deepened serene and complete. In the quiet, Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small, contented smile that spoke of understanding rather than triumph. The mystery had ended, but human nature, she knew, never would, and that perhaps was the greatest puzzle of all, one she would spend her life unravelling, thread by patient thread, beneath the unassuming gentleness of her blue-eyed gaze. The days that followed drifted by gently, each one a little quieter than the last. St. Mildred's returned to its tranquil routine, fishermen at dawn, the postman's whistle at 10, and gossip once more reduced to the comforting trivialities of weather and lacework. The memory of murder, though never fully erased, began to fade into a kind of legend, spoken of only in hushed tones at tea-tables when the afternoons grew dull. Helena Faraday had indeed gone abroad, to Italy as she had planned, and from time to time a postcard arrived at the vicarage addressed to Miss Marple. They were always brief, written in a fine hand that spoke of composure regained. "The air here is soft," one read. "I have begun to sleep again." Another, sent some months later, said simply, "The past no longer frightens me." Alice Brent's fate was less easily mended. From London came reports of her confinement at a small institution near Hampstead, a place devoted to rest and moral rehabilitation. Miss Marple, whose compassion was as keen as her intellect, visited once, arriving unannounced with flowers and a small parcel of sugared biscuits. The girl was thinner, paler, but her eyes held a clarity they had never possessed before. She seemed startled to see the old lady. Then, as though the weight of pretence had at last slipped from her shoulders, she said softly, "You were right. It was never about hate. It was about shame." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Most wickedness, my dear, grows out of shame. The heart that cannot forgive itself is far more dangerous than the one that hates others." They spoke for a while, quietly, of ordinary things, the changing seasons, the roses at Seaside Cottage, the sound of the sea. When Miss Marple rose to go, Alice caught her hand. "Do you think people can change?" she asked. Miss Marple's answer was simple and true. "Yes, but it takes honesty and time. You have both now." When she left the institution that day, Miss Marple walked slowly along the shaded lane that led back to the station. The air was cool, filled with the scent of rain and lilacs. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a kind of serene melancholy that always came at the end of such stories. Justice, she reflected, was rarely perfect. It was a thing stitched from compromise and conscience, more patchwork than embroidery, and yet, in its own imperfect way, it held. By the time she returned to St. Mary Mead, summer had ripened fully. The roses in her garden were in bloom, the bees busy among the lavender, and the village was alive with the easy gossip of ordinary life. Miss Hartnell had taken up a new interest in bridge. The vicar's wife was organising a fete, and the butcher's boy was once again suspected of stealing apples. All was, in its own way, exactly as it should be. One evening, as she sat by her window, knitting in the fading light, a knock came at the door. When she opened it, she found Inspector Graves standing there, his expression warm with the familiarity of friendship. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple," he said, "but I was passing through and thought I might bring you a small token of thanks." From his pocket he produced a little box. Inside lay a seashell, smooth pale pink, polished by the tide. "From St. Mildred's," he explained. "I thought you might like a reminder of the case." Miss Marple smiled. "How kind of you, Inspector, though I dare say I shall not forget it easily." They sat together for a short while, sharing tea and quiet reflection. Graves spoke of his coming retirement, of moving to the countryside and keeping bees. "After all these years," he said, "I think I've learned that crime is less about villains than about vanity, envy, or desperation. It's always the ordinary sins, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, the extraordinary crimes are only ever born of ordinary motives. That's what makes them so dreadful and so fascinating." When he left, the evening had deepened into twilight. Miss Marple returned to her chair, the seashell resting on the table beside her. Its faint sheen caught the lamplight, and she thought of the sea at St. Mildred's, the way it looked at dawn, calm and endless, hiding all manner of secrets beneath its surface. Life, she mused, was much the same. Beneath its stillness lay depths that even the keenest eye could never fully fathom. As she resumed her knitting, her mind wandered over the events once more. The poisoned cup, the letters, the lies, the desperate need for love that had driven each of them to ruin. And as always, she found no hatred in her reflections, only a kind of weary compassion. People, she thought, were hopelessly foolish creatures, capable of deceit, cruelty, and betrayal, yet equally capable of remorse, courage, and tenderness. The line between the two was thinner than anyone cared to admit. The clock chimed softly, and Miss Marple looked up, her blue eyes thoughtful. Somewhere in the village, a nightingale began to sing. The sound floated through the open window, pure and unbroken, a song of continuity and endurance. Miss Marple smiled to herself, setting aside her knitting to listen. "Another case closed," she murmured, though her tone held no finality, only acceptance. She had seen too much to believe that any ending was truly an ending. There would always be another secret, another story, another tangle of human folly waiting to be gently, patiently unwound. That was the way of the world, and she, for her part, was content to keep untangling it as long as she drew breath. Outside, the moon climbed above the rooftops, silvering the garden in its soft light. The roses gleamed faintly, their petals opening to the night air. Miss Marple rose, drew the curtains halfway, and paused once more at the window. The world, she thought, was neither just nor unjust, it simply was, and within its endless turning, kindness and cruelty danced side by side, bound together like threads in her knitting. She smiled again, faintly but truly. "Ah, well," she whispered, "we must keep stitching, mustn't we?" And with that she returned to her chair, her needles clicking softly in the quiet. The fire burned low, the clock ticked on, and in the warm, lamplit peace of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple, gentle, shrewd, and infinitely wise, wove once more her patient pattern, one small stitch at a time, as the world outside spun endlessly on.